say, you got to believe what I say and shut up. No, actually, I don't think that's true at all. It was an intense conversation, but that was a good one. Oh, for those of you who don't know me, I need to introduce myself. My name is John Immel. I run a blog called spiritualtyranny.com. I want to make a point of distinction. My blog is not a discernment blog. It's a blog about ideas. I wrote a book called Blight in the Vineyard, Exposing the Roots, Myths, and Emotional Torment of Spiritual Tyranny. If you like the kind of stuff that you hear me talk about, you will find a lot more of that in here. Highly recommend. You can find it on Amazon, $23.99. Shameless promotional plug. I'm a capitalist. Buy my book, please. Okay. I brought you up to the collapse, effectively, of civilization. And that collapse lasts for almost 800 years because Augustine stands virtually intellectually unopposed. There are, of course, medieval theologians and so forth that do rise up. Some of them are pretty smart, but ultimately they have nothing important to say in the evolution of Western thought. The result is, for all of their departures and all of their good ideas, they never abandon the rudiments of orthodoxy. And so they have nothing new to offer. Until we get to about 1250 with St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, everybody in this room, I need you to look around and become very particularly aware of the environment you inhabit. And everybody online, I want you to look around your house. And I want you to pay attention to all of the things that you have, and in particular, the things that reside in science. Light, the switch on the wall, the electricity, your computer. The fact that you are looking at a computer screen that takes advantage of quantum mechanics to produce everything, your ability to interact with us here. Everything that you see in your house is based on what comes next. Now, it takes man an enormous amount of time to unravel this. St. Thomas Aquinas reintroduces Aristotle into Western thought in 1250. But we don't actually get to freedom, and I think you can see me online if I walk all the way over here. We don't actually get to freedom, liberty, and knowledge until almost 1700. Well, right at about 1700. Men spends an enormous amount of time in this doleful horror story. And it is Aquinas who gives us Aristotle. And Aristotle is who bails us out of the madness. And this is actually the reason I want to talk about Aristotle, because ultimately I am going to get to the impact of Neo-Calvinism on the United States of America. And by the time I get done with the next two sessions, I want you absolutely aware that America is not possible without Aristotle and without John Locke. The impact, you got to know what you're about ready to lose. If you don't understand what you're about ready to lose, you'll never understand why I object to Augustine and Luther and Calvin. Because if that's your total frame of reference, what difference does it make? If you live in Syria today, and I say, you know what, if Neo-Calvinism comes roaring back and it's going to actually stop the jihadists look around and say, well, what's the difference? I have the exact same, I effectively live in the Dark Ages already under Islam. What's the difference? There is no difference. Because ultimately, Augustine's doctrine produced the exact same Dark Ages that is still prevailing in the Middle East. And it is all because they ran Aristotle out on a rail. They did exactly the same thing to Aristotle that the church did to Aristotle. They condemned him. Now, I'm not going to go over how Aquinas integrated Aristotle into Christianity. That would be a long and tedious project. So I'm just going to start with Aristotle and the elements and roots of Aristotle. Oh, I do want to explain why I had Paul write this up here. I go back to my house last night to finalize the PowerPoint slide, and I can't find it. And it actually getting all this laid out in PowerPoint how I wanted it, I knew it was going to take longer than I had, so I'm going to do it. Paul, somebody, and I can't write this well, so if I wrote this out, you would think I was illiterate. So Paul wrote it, thank you. Okay, Aristotle is the most important figure in all of Western thought. Now, with that endorsement, do I recommend you read him? No, not so much. Here's why. Of course, and since I'm constantly encouraging people to follow up on my scholarship, go read what I've said. Go find the sources that I talk about, and do your own work. That probably seems like an awkward thing for me to say. However, if you go to Aristotle, this is what you will be treated to. Categories, section 1, part 1. Now, this is part of Aristotle's corpus. And that, actually, I think this is the first 2 paragraphs out of his work. Here's how it reads. For those of you online who can't see this, things are said to be named equivocally when, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. Thus, a real man and a figure in a picture can both lay claim to the name animal. Yet these are equivocally so named, for though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. I'm going to stop there because you get the idea. It is long and tedious. And here's the problem that we've got with Aristotle. The core of what we have, we think are lecture notes. There are historical sources that attribute to him an amazing speaking capacity and that his writing was a pleasure to read. That's not that. So I am, of course, the conspiracy theorist in me. When the church condemned him, I fully expect that they set out to eradicate his writing just like they did every other heretic for 1,500 years. So I think the stuff that was easy to read and understand was either wiped out by the Catholic Church or it was wiped out by Islam. Islam did get a handle of it. One of the Aristotle made a brief stop, I think, right around, what was it, 1100, somewhere just about 1100, 1000, 1100 AD. And they actually had a renaissance of sorts, and eventually that also died out because the logical end of Islam is war and destruction, and of course they set out to destroy anything that wasn't endorsed by Allah. So I think a lot of the works that we lost were lost to that intellectual purge. But the stuff that we do have is very highly technical. And so it takes an enormous amount of effort to unravel what he's after. Of course, that's not, I didn't learn Aristotle by this. I learned it from a lot of other sources. Okay, so as we know, Plato creates this world of forms. Aristotle spends 20 years in Plato's academy. For a series of reasons, he leaves Athens, and then eventually those series of reasons resolve, and he comes back and he creates his own school called the Lyceum. But while he was in Plato's academy, he was considered one of Plato's best students, and he was a committed Platonist. He accepted the premise of Platonism from the beginning to the end, a full philosophical statement. However, during his time away from Athens, he began to rethink. Why he began to rethink, I guess I don't know. I'm sure somebody does. I don't think I do. But at the end of the day, he decided Plato was wrong. And not just a little wrong. Plato was catastrophically wrong. And as such, he began to rethink the whole of philosophy and the whole shape and scope of philosophy. Now, in the grand scheme of intellectuals, Plato was a genius on levels that is hard to grasp for people in everyday life. But still, Plato had ideas that came before him that he built on. Aristotle had nothing before him to arrive at his conclusions. Everything before him was exactly the opposite of what he said. And so for Aristotle to arrive at, and not only just in philosophy specifically, but he went on to, he was a biologist and a scientist, and he had an enormous capacity for learning and knowledge and understanding. So his level of genius has probably not been paralleled since on planet Earth. It's really probably that simple. Now, having said that, there are some substantial errors in Aristotle, or at least the forms and sources that we have. There are some errors. And so one of the biggest problems that Aristotle's always had is his inconsistencies have always been the undermining value. What we have of Plato is large and consistent. What we have of Aristotle is actually very narrow, and there are some fundamental inconsistencies. And in the world of philosophy, the most consistent formulation wins. And it's crucial that you understand why this is important. We are here specifically challenging the rudiments of the Neo-Calvinist movement. And we are actually pushing back against a huge body of ideas that are all internally consistent. It has had, the heavy lifting has been done. The modern age, the modern Neo-Calvinist thinkers are really third and fourth rate thinkers. All the heavy lifting has already been done for them. All they're doing is taking the heavy lifting and repackaging it for the modern age. So whenever they see an inconsistency, all they have to do is refer back to the arguments of old. And as a rule, the arguments of old handled the inconsistency. One of the biggest problems within Christianity has been no one has ever successfully sustained a consistent, whole, developed thought in response to Calvinism. And that includes Arminianism. Arminianism is actually not the opposite of Calvinism. And because Augustine spoke unopposed for so long, most of the people who did offer a rebuttal were ultimately condemned as heretics. One of the most obvious examples is Pelagius. Most of you are Pelagians. However, you don't know it. And the reason you don't know it is because Pelagius was condemned way back in the 4th century, third, 4th century. I'm sure there's a scholar out there that will correct me, but way back there. Most of the doctrines that we talked about, particularly in regard to the doctrine of sanctification, are Pelagian doctrines. And of course, the Calvinists condemn Pelagius, and even semi-Pelagianism, okay? You can actually go read Institutes of the Christian Religion, I believe it is, chapter 3, and Calvin will overtly condemn the kinds of things we're talking about sanctification being semi-Pelagianism, and it is actually heresy. So now, back to my original point. The consistency of a line of thought, the most consistent formulation wins in the world of philosophy. But now we get to see the power of ideas, because even with these inconsistencies, the Aristotelian framework is enormously powerful, and you will begin to understand why. Aristotle begins to object to Plato's world of forms. He is going to reject Plato's metaphysics at its root. And here's what I'm going to do. We're going to talk about his forms, we're going to talk about Aristotle's rejection of Plato's forms. Then we're going to talk about particulars, and then we're going to talk about universals. I know that doesn't make any sense to you right this minute, but this shapes the roots of what Aristotle had to say. And the conversations that we have had, I think you'll immediately begin to identify why we've struggled so much in this context to organize our arguments. So here we go. We'll start with Aristotle's attack on Plato's forms. I need to make sure everybody knows what those are. Let me briefly reiterate. Plato created a transcendent world that everything that you see, wherever you're sitting, everything that you see, a table, that table is actually a shadow of the real thing, of the perfect thing. And that was actually located in this world called the forms. There was a perfect table in the world of forms, and the table that you see is a shadow. It is imperfect, and therefore a shadow of this perfect thing. Aristotle says, no, the forms are a useless theory because it does not explain this world. This world is filled with particulars, things that move, change, grow, and act. Now, a particular is a table, a chair, a camera, a plate, a shoe, a fill, a zack. Those are particulars. You understand? This is the world that man needs to understand. Man does not need to know Plato's static supernatural world. Here's an example. This world has chairs, tables, dogs, and Calvinists. Plato says that to understand this world, another world must first have chairs, tables, dogs, and Calvinists. As far as Aristotle is concerned, this creates a useless duplication. All that Plato has done is create a useless metaphor, in that it does not address the root question: how does this world reflect the world of forms? By what mechanism does this take place? And of course, there is no answer. Because by definition, all that Plato is saying is this world of forms is somehow a bright enough light that it casts a shadow here. But yet there is still this fundamental division, which means that man is still living in a world that is somehow functionally unreal. Now here is Aristotle's major objection. That gives you a flavor of the kind of argument he levels, but here is his major substantive rejection. To understand this rejection, I need to introduce two concepts: forms, particulars. Forms, I already did that. Particulars and universals. Particulars are self-contained, self-enclosed things. They are entities. Something that exists in itself. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Whatever you see in the world is a particular. You understand that? Now, universals are what is common to a number of particulars. It is the characteristics possessed by many particulars. What is the common denominator of, say, tableness or chairness or circleness? When man conceptualizes these things, he universalizes the concepts into an abstraction. Let me see if I can explain this. I'm mommy's face, and I've got baby on the other side of me. And I look at baby, and baby smiles. And I put a blanket over my face, and baby frowns. And I drop the blanket, and baby smiles. Baby is making the perceptual understanding of mommy's face. But baby has not yet conceptualized mommy's face, doesn't disappear with the blanket. Do you understand? Yes, no, I'm crazy? Okay. This process of learning to identify a particular, this is a remote, but it's not the specific remote. I have remoteness in my hand. I can generalize remote into a generalized concept. That concept can be abstracted to the nth degree, because now I don't have to remember every single remote I ever see in my lifetime. I can now hold in my head the concept, the abstraction of remote. And it encompasses all of the remotes on the planet, you see. This is an enormously powerful part of human cognition. And it is Aristotle's ability to identify the process of going from a particular to the concept to the abstraction that gives Aristotle's metaphysics and epistemology such enormous power. Now, the concept of universal, what Plato did is he took the universal. He said table has a perfect table somewhere else, so that table is the universal, and that's how we know a table generally. Aristotle says that's silly. What you just did is took the abstraction, remoteness, create a universal perfect remote somewhere in another world, and then said, oh, by the way, this remote is a reflection. So in other words, Plato took the universal and made it a particular. This is a powerful, powerful argument. Aristotle called this reification, or literally thing-making. Pretty much, he said, Plato made up this world that had no function and no purpose. And that all that was necessarily important was here and now.
Question.
Yes?
So that according to Plato, for what you're saying, that according to Plato,
Yes.
that's not really a remote.
Yeah, no, this is a shadow of something else. It's a shadow of a perfect thing. You understand?
Got it.
You understand?
It's not material.
Yeah, it's not material.
It's not real.
Not real.
Let me chime into why this is important. I do a lot of reformed reading. The constant theme throughout much of the literature is Plato versus Aristotle.
It is, and let me get to why that is. I'm headed that direction.
And basically, you're reading all of this stuff. I'm a good Christian, reading about theology. What's all of this bickering back and forth about Plato and Aristotle? This is key.
It is key because this is the fundamental conflict, and you'll see why. Are we having a technical difficulty? Okay, good.
Well, hold on. We need to get this all on tape.
Oh, this is.
Huh?
Let's just put it on this.
So are we still taping or no?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the laptop's picking it up. Okay.
Here's how Aristotle explains this. We separate common characteristics of entities, particulars, by our selective awareness. By observing the differences among them, we then reduce things to a common denominator. And this is how we go from particulars to universals. When a baby first enters the world, it looks around and sees chair. It doesn't understand all of these chairs. These are all somehow unique and individual events. But eventually, it identifies the common denominators of chairs. And it begins to conceptualize chair in general. And then it abstracts to the bigger picture. Now notice Aristotle's distinction. Just because we can perform the action of selection does not mean that the common denominator exists in a separate supernatural reality. But separating things in thought is very different than being separated in reality. When man practices this selective process, he is performing abstraction. For example, within this room, we could identify all the shapes of the circle in the room. We can ignore color, and if it's part of a chair or connected to the wall, we can extract the concept circle from each instance. But this mental process does not mean that the circle is out there somewhere in a form. Like I said, Aristotle calls Plato's world of forms the fallacy of reification, literally thing-making. Plato was making a thing out of a human cognitive process. This is a brilliant deduction. Aristotle identifies a fundamental flaw by pointing out that this is really nothing more than how the human consciousness works. It is part of the human consciousness identity, which we're now going to talk about Plato's or Aristotle's metaphysics. Now you should have some basic insight into how Aristotle conceptualizes the world. Here are the basics. Reality exists. What man perceives is reality. There is no conflict between reality and appearance. Reality is what man observes, and any formulation that says otherwise is error. Particulars are the units of reality. The things you see are particulars. As I said, anything you can physically point at, look at, identify, subtract and blank out everything else and look at that, that is a particular. Everything is an individual and a concrete. Individuality is the particular's irreducible element. The thing that individualizes it is the thing. Aristotle expands this concept by saying the particulars are a this and a such. And here's where we get the ability of classification. Remote. It's a this, but it's also a such. It's a specific kind of remote. This remote goes to that little gadget right there. There are other remotes that are classified as television remotes. And there are other remotes that are classified as computer remotes. There are Paul, man, classified different than Susan, woman, a this and a such. This gives us an enormous power of abstraction and organization. Here's another example. The particular man can now be put into the class Homo sapien. Man does this with all particulars. Chairs are classed as type of chairs. Tables are classed of type of tables. Circles are classed of type of circles. And abstractions are universals. Remember, Plato said universals were reserved for this place in the forms. All Aristotle says is no, this is a function of human cognition, and an abstraction is the universal. All we have done is now make the progression between perception to conceptualization to abstraction. The abstraction is the universal. This is a brilliant development in Western thought. Here's how he defines the process of abstraction. Man perceives individual trees until he forms the concept of tree that he abstracts into treeness, and then subsequently categorizes maple trees, oak trees, etc. The abstraction treeness is then the universal. Here is Aristotle's distinction, and this is in direct contrast to Plato. Universals are real. Universals are the objects of conceptual thought. Universals are the abstraction of particulars, but only particulars exist. Let me make a distinction. There was a common paradox. It was called Zeno. Zeno's paradox. Zeno said you couldn't actually cross a room. He said that what would happen, the reason you couldn't cross a room is because you could not cross distance. You would go to half, and then to half again, and then to half again, and then to half again, and to half again. And you could not cross a room by definition. Of course, this is error, because it takes the concept of infinity and turns it into a thing. You do not cross infinity. You cross an identity. And the identity is the distance of the room, 30 feet. Aristotle correctly destroyed Zeno's paradox by observing that the abstraction infinity was not real. It didn't exist. It was an abstraction. We use it as a mental unit, as a mental organizer, but it is not in existence like this. So can we cross a room? Absolutely. Why? Because we're not crossing infinity. We're crossing an identity, 30 feet. We're crossing a particular of measurement. Here, do you understand? Yes, got it, specific. I heard you say it right, correct. Now, most of the, and I'm going to make a little editorial insertion here. Most of the conflicts that we have when rebutting the Neo-Calvinist movement and all collectivist ideologies is the failure to grasp the distinction between concrete particulars, concepts, and abstractions. Most of our theological discussion in here has failed because it has misunderstood these specific distinctions. And the reason the Neo-Calvinists kick our butt so consistently is because they are masters at manipulating the difference between concept and abstraction. I'll let you mull. Particulars, concepts, abstractions. Okay?
Can you give an example of that?
Off the top of my head, no.
Sorry, I didn't put you on the spot.
I just, off the top of my head, no, I can't summarize one in my head. Let me ponder that, put it in a note to me, and maybe I'll think about it.
They're masters at...
They're masters at manipulating. They're masters at manipulating the difference between concepts, particulars, concepts, and abstractions. Actually, you say this all the time. They change the terms. They redefine.
Well, I thought I was going to say that. I'm thinking that's a little bit elementary. Let me throw in the one thing that you see when you listen to them talk is this consistent either-or construct. Okay? It's either this or it's that. You're either a Calvinist or an Arminian. You're either Augustine or Pelagian. You know, I could throw that out there.
Well, I think what John's saying is, I think total depravity is a perfect example, because you have the particular man. Man's the thing, and you have the concept, the abstraction of total depravity. In Calvinist doctrine or Reformed doctrine, total depravity becomes causal. It becomes an actual thing that has causal power over man. It usurps the reality of man and becomes its own real force. It ceases to be a concept that man creates to organize what he observes, and it becomes a force itself. So they are constantly defining the world in terms of real objects and external forces which determine them or control. Is that something?
Actually, I think he's dead on. Do you understand what he just said? He turned actually, it's actually a pretty good example. They turned the abstraction, the metaphysical abstraction, human depravity, into a thing.
Right.
And that thing imposes itself on man. That's the kind of manipulation I'm talking about. But all I'm doing is observing the rudimentary manipulation that they make. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily indicative of just the Neo-Calvinist movement. You see this exact same thing in Marxism. You see this exact same thing in Augustinian doctrine. This is not unique to them. It is learning to identify this manipulation. The better you get at learning to think in principles, learning to think philosophically, the faster you get at being able to point out the flaw in what somebody's saying. Because you can reduce it down to its simplest element. Being able to learn to think in terms of, this is a particular, the concept that I extrapolate this from is remote, and then I can subsume it in the broadest sense. But the broadest sense does not exist. Okay, you understand? Let me keep going here. I think we'll start to unravel a lot of this in your head. Now granted, I've been at this a long time. This is easily fourth year undergraduate work, first, second year graduate work. So be patient with yourself. This will start to make more sense. Because you are daughters and sons of the Enlightenment. I guarantee you believe this stuff. Because you conduct your life after these principles. Because you have lived in the time of the Enlightenment. So let me continue.
We function according to what we've experienced.
We function according to the belief that this exists.
Right.
And it is a thing, and we can identify it and understand it and touch it, measure it, and then manipulate it. We understand that. Let me keep going. Aristotle, and here is Aristotle's terminology. He says, matter is the uniqueness of a particular. Form is the universalizing of those things that the particular shares with other things. So he takes over Plato's concept of form, but he uses it entirely differently. And here is Aristotle's metaphysical law. You cannot have form without matter, and you cannot have matter without form. Here is Plato's fundamental error. He creates a world of forms without matter. And this is the exact same failing in Augustinian doctrine. Augustine's form is the heavenly and the universal, worldly, godly realm. This earth has no form. And that's ultimately what Augustine manipulates to the nth degree throughout the entirety of his ideology. Here's the summary. Particulars exist. Reality is what it appears to human senses. Action, quantity, motion are merely naming what the particulars do. The nature of identity. What is the identity of John? John is a man, John is tall, John has gray hair. As a man, but the manness of him gives him the ability to move, to act, to walk. John has weight. John can be in motion. All of these things are elements of my identity. And identities are what you encounter in the world. So here's what this means. Aristotle is the creator of what is called the primacy of existence. Everybody prior to Aristotle said that it was consciousness that was primary. Some consciousness, whether some variation of man's consciousness or some divine consciousness, imposed its will on the world and shaped it after its fashion. Aristotle says, no, this is backwards. It is reality that comes first, and consciousness engages reality. And this is the Copernican shift in philosophy. Because it puts reality and consciousness as co-weights, co-counterweights, and the ability to define what is. It gives the ability for objective knowledge. With the primacy of consciousness, you have no guarantee of objectivity, because the first question you must ask is, whose consciousness defines reality? Is it Allah? Is it God? Is it ISIS? The moment we say, is it Paul? Whose consciousness? Or if you're a follower of Hegel, is it the state that defines reality? Can the state impose its collective will on the world? With this, all you have is entrenched subjectivism. The primacy of consciousness is nothing more than subjectivism. It is reality first, the primacy of existence first, the correlation of consciousness perceiving that reality that gives you the ability to have objective knowledge. It gives you a plumb line, because man has every confidence that what he sees is. Man's obsession to alter reality via the mind is at the heart and soul of magic. And this is the primacy of consciousness preoccupation. This is how pond scum in the Middle Ages magically became frogs. This is how churches magically produced neo-Calvinist preachers. That was a joke. Everything is and is not. Everything is mutable and changeable. There is no reality and there is no causality. Men practice but here's the thing. Well, let me continue with the thought. Men practice a primacy of consciousness metaphysic all the time. They see something horrible, and the first thing to do is start saying, no, that can't be. The blogosphere is doing this with Calvinists all the time. They see yet one more manifestation of neo-Calvinist abuse and just magically go, no, that can't be. It can't be the doctrine. Yes. They pretend the relationship between ideas and outcomes do not exist. That must mean it is not reality. This is the implications of the primacy of consciousness. They are defining the measure of truth by their own determination in a given consciousness. Now let's move to Aristotle's epistemology. A man starts his existence tabula rasa, as a blank slate. Man has no innate ideas. One of the biggest problems with Play the World, Plato's Forms is, well, how does man ever understand, okay, there's this other world, but how does man ever get this concept of tableness? Where does that come from? How does it just show up? If he has no ability to perceive it by any means, how does he get it? Well, the historic solution to this was the concept of innate ideas, that somehow man knew it. Before he was born, man knew it, and he remembers it as he grows. Well, this creates a whole host of problems. Are you suggesting the pre-existence of souls? In the Augustinian version, are you saying that man fell before the fall? Are you saying that all of these things, or these innate ideas, all originate pre-consciousness.
Sounds like Socrates.
Well, and this theory was very common throughout. This was not unique, but this explanation of how man arrives at these universals, this was its explanation. And of course, it opens up an enormous number of philosophical problems. Aristotle closes this door. He said, no. Man is born a blank slate. That's not where this comes from. The way man gets his knowledge is it begins with the senses, perceptions. Man's faculty for understanding reality is his perceptions. All formulations that write off the senses at this point are wrong. If you write off the senses, you've basically wrapped man in bubble wrap and blinded him and deafened him, and there is no ability for him to actually experience the broader reality of Paul. You had a question on your face.
Oh, well, you're going to have that problem with me because everything you're saying I read all the time.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, in theological terms, like what you just said 10 minutes ago about the primacy of truth.
Mm-hmm. Primacy of consciousness. Primacy of consciousness.
Oh, yeah, primacy of consciousness. Why am I thinking John MacArthur Jr., justification and sanctification are never separate but distinct?
These are the fundamental conflicts, and we're going to get to laws. Aristotle's laws.
I apologize. My mind, because I read a lot of Reformed things. This is all. It's just like Susan yesterday when you were talking, and because of what she studied in the Puritans, you're conjuring up a lot of things that we've read separately from those perspectives. It's the same thing. Okay, cool. Well, now I do need to actually explain how Aristotle addresses the issue of illusion. This is one of the efforts to devalue or to invalidate the senses, and it goes something like this: a man sees a rainbow, and he sees it from a distance. It physically looks like it touches the ground, and so he goes to try to find where it touches the ground, and of course he can't find it. And the more he tries to walk towards the rainbow, the harder it is to see the rainbow. Or a similar example is you take a stick is straight in the air, you stick it in the water, and you look at it, and suddenly the stick bends. The historic criticism is, see, the senses deceive us. We really can't rely on the senses. And Aristotle says, nonsense. You've once again made a crucial fundamental error. The senses actually gave you the correct information. You interpreted the information wrong. You misunderstood what that information was designed to give you. In the stick in the water, we have, of course, you're an engineer, so you certainly understand the implications of how water moves and shapes light. The stick didn't bend. The light coming back at the senses is what changed the appearance of the stick. The same thing is true of a rainbow. Rainbow, of course, is light moving through water mist, and it creates and diffuses and diffracts the light. And so the illusion that you think you see is really the correct manifestation of the entities, light, water, air. You get the idea. You understand the distinction? And this is how Aristotle sets out to validate the senses. Now, Aristotle's next epistemological advance is called concept formation. And I've talked about this kind of implicitly throughout the entire discussion. But I want to reiterate here. Man starts with perceptions of particulars. And we have chairs and plates and cups and bottles. Those are particulars. Man then identifies common denominators. Types of chairs. Chairs with padding, chairs without padding. Chairs with wheels on them. Understand? We have types of chairs. Okay, I think it'll be easy to understand if I do this. How many of you watched Sesame Street? I think you're old enough that most of you probably do. You watched Sesame Street? Is it still on?
Yes.
Oh, wait. Okay, that's fantastic. I mean, well, I don't know if it's the new nonsense what Sesame Street. When I watched it, I thought it was actually pretty good. I saw it a couple years ago and I thought it was just propaganda. I don't know. Anyway, there was a song on there. What was the song about? One of these things is not like the other. One of these things does not belong. On a very rudimentary level, that is the process of concept formation. Sesame Street put up 3 circles and a square. And the kid, the 3, 4, 5-year-old, 15-year-old, I don't know,
17-year-old. He doesn't watch it now.
looks at the screen, and he sees a series of circles, and he sees the square, and he goes, okay, that's not like that. He's making a contrast. And he's identifying the commonalities of circles and the distinctions of the rectangle, and that's how he begins to form these concepts. This is exactly what Aristotle was pointing to. This is the process of abstraction in rudimentary form. This is how man brings order to his perceptions and begins to classify reality by identifying identities. It is by this method that man goes from circle to wheel to cart to transportation. Do you see how I built the progression? This is how man builds ever-increasing levels of complexity. He takes the very small, the particular, and he begins to form and shape them, and he understands that each conceptualization builds on each conceptualization and each conceptualization until he gets the broadest abstraction and transportation. Perception, and the order goes this way: perception to conception to abstraction to universal. And I'm going to keep saying this because this is central to the world that we inhabit. And until you understand how this functions, it is very easy to get wrapped up in the Augustinian ideas and their specific effort to divorce, and the followers of those ideas, their specific effort to divorce the world from reality and the world from man's mind. This is a central attack that we will see over and over again as we progress through this, progress through my discussion. Now, this leads to Aristotle's law of identity. The behavior of a particular is defined by its nature. The essential characteristic of a particular are what define its identity. The essence of each thing is unique to that thing. This is what all science is based on. You will now understand the axiom of human existence in 3 laws. And here are the 3 laws: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. And I probably have in Aristotle, blah, 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 blah. The law of identity is the axiom. The next 2 laws are the subsequent corollaries. It is from this foundation that every cognitive human success originates. The law of identity says that man can't be man and not man. That a horse can't be a horse and not horse. That A cannot be A and non-A. In Aristotle's words, if, however, a definition, for example, man, horse, A, were not limited, but one were to say that the word is an infinite number of meanings, obviously reasoning would be impossible. For not to have one meaning is to have no meaning. If words have no meaning, our reasoning with one another, and indeed ourselves, has been annihilated. Think of the conversations that we've had. How frustrating it has been to land on how we're going to discuss these things. How often the Neo-Calvinists change definitions, and they place mutually exclusive ideas together. This is what they are doing. They are annihilating reason. For it is impossible to think, if anything we do not think of, but one thing. Paul is very fond of talking about the grammatical approach. This is actually 1 or 2 levels too high on the philosophical scale. Words are really in description of entities. And it is our means by which we communicate the nature of our perceptual experience. And words hold abstractions and concepts. So when somebody says to you the clear meaning of Scripture, what you first must say is clear by what context? Because unless you have the law of identity in action, you will find that they don't have a context. It is usually a free-floating abstraction. And they are treating the abstraction as if it is the only thing that matters. The Neo-Calvinists are masters of wrecking the law of identity. The law of non-contradiction says, I think I have a slide. It is impossible then that being a man should mean precisely not being a man. And it is not possible to be and not be at the same time. But the point in question is not this, whether the same thing can at the same time be and not be in name, but whether it can be in fact. This is the important part. Can it actually exist as two mutually exclusive things? The answer is no, never. The law of the excluded middle says this, but on the other, oh, well, I guess I have a slide. But on the other hand, there can be no intermediate between contradictories. But if one subject we must either affirm or deny on any one predicate. This is clear. In the first place, if we define that the true and the false are, he is basically saying you can't punt. You can't go, you know what, I can't figure out how to reconcile these things, so poof. Yes?
This goes to what Ayn Rand so succinctly put in the book Atlas Shrugged, that contradictions cannot exist. If you find yourself a contradiction exists,
Yes.
Check your premises.
Check your
One
premises.
of them is wrong.
Something is wrong, correct. And without this, and what the problem within the medieval world is they could never check their premise. They always had an explanation for whatever it was. And so they could never identify an error. You actually see this, dramatically within churches. I think it's stunning to watch them rationalize one of two directions, either why God is for them or God is with them. The church roof falls on everybody, God is against them. The church roof falls on everybody, God is with them. And in each instance, you have mutually exclusive ideas here. Is it God's judgment or is it God's blessing? And they will do Herculean efforts, reasoning efforts, to try to justify why they are both in the exact same event is basically two separate outcomes. You are ultimately looking at a violation of the law of excluded middle. You cannot punt. If you find an inconsistency in your thinking, you have something fundamentally wrong with your thinking. And I understand how that impacts a vast percentage of Christian doctrine. I get it. But that doesn't change the flaw. Just because you don't have it, this is me going back to the implications of the primacy of consciousness. If your consciousness is first, then you can rewrite reality however you like. But if you're going to go with the law, the primacy of existence, you cannot do that. You must first identify reality, then figure out how you fit into that. That is how we get to objective knowledge.
It's like, and that's why my objection when people say, well, we sort of have free will, but we don't really, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to take two mutually exclusive concepts, free will and determinism, and merge them, integrate them in the singularity of self. So what you're really trying to do, at the end of the day, is you're trying to say that the human self, that man being man, is somehow man and not man at the same time. What you're doing is you're trying to parse the metaphysics of man. You're trying to make man a function of two mutually exclusive forces. That's what I'm saying. Either man is free or he's determined. He can't be, the law of excluded middle says, he can't be a little bit of both. Because the next question when somebody says, well, man has some free will, but in other things he doesn't have free will, you say, okay, where's the distinction in man's self between his freedom and his determination? Where exactly does the free man begin and the determined man end? Nobody can answer that question. And the reason is because man, the reality, is absolute. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to take two mutually exclusive determinist forces and sort of integrate them into man. And it never works. again, which is why I always ask the question, okay, if that's your premise, where does one begin in the other start? And the answer is,
and of course,
I don't really
determinism,
know.
you're exactly right, and this is one of the fundamental problems within, determinism has been in the philosophical framework long before the Calvinists got hold of it. Actually, Augustine was a soft determinist. He allowed man some freedom, some action of choice. And others before him did the same thing. But you don't see hard determinism actually show up until we actually get up in here. Hard determinism shows up because some of the philosophical expectations of the mechanistic world decided that because man was in a world of causality, man really didn't have a choice. And so you ended up with hard determinism. But John Calvin actually took it from Augustine's soft determinism and turned it into hard determinism. That man actually has no choice. But to actually get into, from my perspective, to get into the discussion of determinism, causality, at this stage in the game, I really can't do it, but I think your point is well made. It is holding two mutually exclusive ideas and trying to figure out how to reconcile it, and with stunning consistency, the real answer is punt. I don't know. We have mystery, God's mystery. Let me continue.
Well, let me interject one thing, and this is all good as long as we define it. I say that man has free will, but in God's sovereignty, he determines a good end. You're saying, well, we don't know how it's going to end, right?
I'm saying,
so let's be fair.
Yeah.
And it's okay, but let's define it, okay? Because that's what we're about, defining these thoughts and in fact letting people come to their own conclusions. So it's a mystery to me how God is sovereign and says, man has free will, but I'm going to predetermine a good end to the world. You're saying we don't know.
Right. I would say check the premises, and I would say, if God has a determined outcome already, then any appeal you make to free will becomes ultimately irrelevant. You can say I have freedom to do this or that, and I said this to Wade Burleson on my blog. We had a discussion about this because he made the same argument you did, and I said, okay, you put a man in a box and you shoot him to the middle of the sun.
Wade didn't make the same argument that I made.
Well, okay.
No. Wade Burleson and I don't make any of the same arguments.
No, I'm not likely to do that. What I did was, you put a man in an enclosed space, and you say, within this enclosed space, you have freedom to do whatever you want to do, but I'm going to shoot you to the sun, and in 2 days you're hitting right in the middle of the sun. Well, whatever man does in the box is ultimately irrelevant to the only relevant outcome, which is he burns up in the sun. So to make the argument that man has free will in context is ultimately to make an irrational argument to say, well, the outcome's already been determined, therefore what you do now is ultimately meaningless. Which is, in other words, if it's irrelevant, then you can't identify it as free because irrelevancy can't have any kind of definitive meaning. You can't say free will if that free will has no functional outcome.
I understand, and we also agree on the ultimate conclusion that's irrefutable. Okay? You're saying we don't know how it's going to end. I'm saying, yes, we do know how it's going to end. So that's fair, right?
I'm saying you can't know what does not exist, and neither can God. If it doesn't exist, then you can't know it by definition.
Okay.
If it does exist, then you don't have a free choice by definition. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, Jan.
All right, let me persist with this. In summation, the law of the identity of A is in fact the identity of A. The particulars of A must never contradict. For A to maintain its identity, there can be no middle compromise on something not A. This is the foundation of causality. It is because man can identify A and hold no contradiction on the identity of A, it empowers man to successfully make a distinction and see the relationship on how the particulars interact. This is causality. Without causality, everything in reality remains a totally unprecedented event. Man can't tell why one thing happens versus another. This is crucial to understanding reality. The foundations of causality and the laws that govern them. I sound really hot all of a sudden. Am I not? No, I feel like I'm bringing it.
No, you sound great, John.
Okay. The foundations of causality, the laws that govern causality, is a corollary to the correct judgment of reality. The inability to identify cause and effect is man's central and greatest failing. And insanity is directly tied to the inability to identify causality. Our reality testers are directly related to our ability to identify cause and effect between objects in space, and abstractions, and action, and motion. Here's a great example. If you ever want a laugh or maybe a cry, it's hard to tell. Google deer crossing, woman radio show, deer crossing. Have you heard this? How many of you have heard this? Okay.
I have.
Okay. A woman calls into a radio show, and it's a 5-minute segment. And she calls in and she's like, I have tried to talk to my legislators about this. I've gone to the state about this. And I really am trying to get the message out about this. And I'm talking about all of these deer crossing signs. I do not understand why the government puts these deer crossing signs right beside interstates. Because when they do that, the deer cross right through the interstate. Why don't they take the deer crossing signs and put them, like, say, near schools? Because if they went near schools, they cross with the children and be safe. But they cross right over the interstate. And you're listening to this and you're thinking, yeah, certainly this is a joke. But you keep listening, and the hosts on the radio keep telling them, well, you know that this doesn't go together, right? There is no causality here. The deer crossing signs don't make the deer cross there. And either she was an A-grade actor or exactly what we all think. Nutty. Because at the end of the day, what she was failing to do was understand causality. And this is central to human rational health. The inability to identify causality correctly is largely the source of almost all of your psychological and individual woes. So now you can begin to grasp why it is from Aristotle that all effective human cognition flows. All laws of logic, all of man's conceptual capacity, all of man's reason, and most importantly, man's capacity to grasp the world in which he lives. Question. And why is this a threat to despots the world over? Second question. Why has every oppressive ideology sought to unseat Aristotle? Third question. Why do tyrants cling to Aristotle's shoulders while trying to cut off his head? Here is the answer. Because Aristotelian thought means that existence is knowable, understandable, and practicable, that all men have the means to arrive at truth, that knowledge is available for all who will use the laws and the rules of logic to obtain it. This foundational concept was revolutionary. It was the original Copernican shift from the transcendent world of Plato's forms. Indeed, without Aristotle's foundation, Copernicus was not possible. And neither is any other advance in human knowledge. And herein is Aristotle's impact on Western thought. When using the laws of thought, the mind of man is effective to understand man's existence. An existence that is understandable, or an existence that is identifiable is an existence that is understandable. An existence that is understandable is an existence that is explorable. An existence that is explorable is an existence that is controllable. An existence that is controllable is an existence that man can master. And this is exactly what happened. Thomas Aquinas introduced Aristotle into the horror story that was the Augustinian Dark Ages, where crime was a starving serf eating the king's deer, where punishment was an iron maiden, or the rack, or the stocks, where civil liberties meant the government could do no wrong because the king had a divine right to any action, where child labor law was mandatory 16-hour days scratching in the fields of the Lord's demesne, with a stick to plant the Lord's crop so that the father could pay the Lord's taxes. where plagues were heaped on the heads of sinners, where the princes and kings waged yet another war against the Lollards or the Catholics or the Protestants, and teenagers pledged their oath of loyalty to fight in religious wars. Aristotle's ideas soon inspired the Renaissance. Now, we got into a conversation about art in one of my last sessions, but I want you to notice now a contrast between medieval art and, say, the art of the Renaissance. Compare medieval art with, say, the Sistine Chapel. Notice now the impact of Aristotle. Now man is no longer this cringing, horrified, tormented beast writhing in the flames of the pit of hell. But now man is portrayed as almost in the very image of his own maker. It is a powerful contrast. This is how ideas, the entire progression that I talked about yesterday, how ideas impact as the metaphysical statement rolls out to people, how they begin to roll back to themselves through art, the images and the pictures that affirm their metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical assumptions. For the next 100 years, philosophy moves in fits and starts. It travels down blind alleys, intellectual cul-de-sacs. By the time we get to the 17th century, philosophers are exceedingly aware that they need a new start. A new start equated throwing off the Augustinian metaphysical and epistemological framework. Mysticism and dogmatism continued to wreck everything it touched. Something was very obviously wrong. The thinkers in the 17th century merely had to observe that the human history was dominated by ignorance, superstition, poverty, and despotism. Revelations did not work. Faith was merely government-enforced superstition. Dogmatism was really despotism. Despotism led to oppression and poverty. Philosophers needed a new method. This new method was reason. And this is called the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason gave way to the Enlightenment. The Age of Reason, this is the 16th century, right? Help me out, guys, school teachers. This is 16th century.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the 17th century. Somehow I always have to rethink this in my head every time I talk about it.
Confuses me.
This is where the thinkers start to advocate reason. This is where reason became the standard. This is where it was still advocated by a relatively small group. This is how we see the ideas start expanding into the broader world. You want to know why? Actually, I'm going to take a little bitty side trip here. You want to know why state governments, tyrannical governments, always want your kids in their schools? Do you see how long, actually, we'll start back here. Do you see how long it took for Aristotle's ideas to gain ascendancy? Well, how about if you don't have to do this? How about if you don't have to persuade men? How about if you're a good neo-Calvinist preacher and all you got to say is, you know what, submit to my authority. I'm going to tell you what to think. How about if you don't have any of that? If you don't have a state school, you got to wait to persuade men for them to understand these ideas. But you know what? If all they ever have to do is say, you know what, parents, you've got to give your kids up to us, and we're going to tell your kids what to think. And we're going to teach them some of this Common Core math. And we're going to compel your kids to believe what we want them to believe. You don't have to worry about the evolution of thought. You don't have to worry about people being persuaded. You have them at the first generation. That was my side trip. Huh?
Rabbit track.
Yeah. So here we see the world beginning to accept the concepts of the Enlightenment, the superiority, the efficacy of reason, the ability of reason to actually understand the world within which man lives. Now, we still have some problems. Philosophy has not really, I told you earlier, there were some problems with Aristotle's thoughts. The inconsistencies required that men start to try to figure out what those inconsistencies arrived at, which led to the rationalists' discussion, and eventually to the empiricists' discussion here. I'm not going to talk to you about the rationalists. But I want you to notice the explosion. You should recognize most of these names. Bacon, Galileo, Newton. Here's Descartes. Don't worry about him. But these men here, Bacon, Galileo, Newton, and Locke. These represent the core, the explosion of the power of human reason and what it ultimately produces. Here is where man finally gains freedom. This is the one thing that was not yet figured out, political thought. Remember, we started out yesterday, I started at the top, metaphysics, then I went to epistemology, then I went to ethics, and the last one is politics. The power of Aristotle's metaphysics and epistemology ultimately work out into this area here, and we finally get to an ethic that says man is able, and the nature of his ability empowers him towards self-governance. These ideas have little seeds back in here, and man continues to argue for the nature of his own self-governance. Because why? Because man has ability. On my blog, I consistently ask this question: who owns man? At its root, all governments presume there's only been two options in the whole history of the human world, or the human race. Either the state owns man or man owns himself. And in political action, this is where we finally get this. This is how man came out from underneath the horror story that was the Middle Ages, the horror story that was an Augustinian doctrine, the horror story that remained after Calvin. Here's where man finally gets free. Now, here's the challenge that I have. This brings me to the emergence of John Locke. And Paul, I'm going to offer this up for your consideration. I told you that all of this, what I'm talking about, until you understand what you're about ready to lose, you really won't understand my objections to the overarching construct that we're resisting. I think John Locke is essential, but I have 17 pages of John Locke notes. And I think for me to successfully, and I've been debating on whether to get rid of this, but I think I've decided that I don't really have a choice because it is the central, one of the central, actually, I'm going to say the central issue of the National Socialist Germany and how it ultimately impacts the United States. And that is the issue in the addressing of capitalism. I have 4 pages of notes on capitalism, which means my next session would be long, and I still wouldn't be done. So I will let you ponder. But like I said, 17, fortunately for most of this, I think I can read what was here, but I will let you decide how you want to handle this.
Well, there's the way the schedule's designed, there's lots of wiggle room.
Okay.
Okay, so obviously we need to break for lunch.
Yes.
Let me bring the schedule up real quick. This shouldn't be too difficult to ascertain.
You like the one that Andy does now?
Are we off?
John.
Oh, are we, hang on a second. Are we done? Are we off? Are we still online?